I'm going to show you how to paint a realistic tiger and water in acrylics with a bit of airbrushing. Today's painting is being painted on a Frederick's Belgian linen canvas. This is a 24 by 36 inch canvas. It's big. And just for transparency, I am sponsored by Frederick's, but they were already the only canvas I used, so are you guys sick of hearing me say that yet? For the type of detail that I needed to do for this, and especially with the airbrushing, I needed a really smooth canvas, so that's why I went with this one. If you are supporters over on Patreon, make sure to head over where I have a 3.5-hour version of this demonstration available for you now. If you are unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to my weekly 1 to 2 hour long tutorials, along with all of my past tutorials. There are over 150 there that you have access to immediately when you sign up. If you want to see what videos I do have available, I will have a link in the video description to my video library. That video library also has a free 2-hour long colored pencil demonstration if you want to watch that now. You don't have to be signed up for Patreon, you just get to head over and watch that for free. Now let's move on to this demonstration. I started by painting my background just kind of a plum color. I mixed some brown, some purple, and black together just to get a dark base. It didn't really matter what color I had. I just wanted something that was very dark. I then used a white charcoal pencil, and I have a list of the supplies that I like in the video description if you want to check those out. But I used a white charcoal pencil to draw out the tiger and all of the ripples that I was going to want in the water. I am using the airbrush for my background because it gives me a very nice, soft, out of focus look. If you missed last week's video, I'll have a card pop up so you can check that out. I do show you how you can get something similar. It's not quite the same, but it is similar without using an airbrush. But for this one, I do like this style with an airbrush because you can get through it very quickly. The majority of what I'm doing here is just being done with white paint, and then I'm going back over and doing what is essentially a glaze, using transparent greens and yellows on top of it. It's easier if I layer it like this than trying to get the right color in the right place right from the beginning. I do like to layer things in stages this way. Now, I thought having the circles, that bokeh look in the background would be kind of cool on this until I saw what it looked like, and it just was not working with the look that I wanted here. So you'll see when I start airbrushing my color back over those circles that I'm using the template for, I'm just going to darken those up. It'll be very subtle. It's really going to push those back. And it gives me a nice texture, but I don't want them to be as bold as what they are now. This step that I'm airbrushing part of the water, honestly, was kind of a waste of time. I really didn't need to do that because I ended up doing brushwork, regular traditional brushwork, just to achieve this section in here. So this, like I said, not really necessary. And if you are interested in airbrushing, I am going to have quite a few videos coming up showing you both how to clean the airbrush and to keep it from clogging, and just lots of tips there very soon. I'm working on a piece now for a tutorial. So now that I've got all that white in there, I'm going to go ahead and go back through and just start blocking in a bunch of the color, or layering in the colors. I'm mixing in some greens. I've got that reddish brown, kind of a burnt sienna in there. And right now, the green behind the tiger, you can see that is super bright, too bright. I will tone that down quite a bit as I keep layering. Pulling some black that actually has a bit of purple, I believe, in some of that mixed in, just a touch so it's not flat black. So now we can go ahead and move on to the tiger. This was a part of the live stream. I'll have a card pop up so you can check that out if you want to watch that in real time. So this portion will move really fast. And I'm just blocking in where the eyes are going to go, just the general shape. And I'll come back through later on and better define them. I'm using a liner brush. This is one, it's a synthetic hog-haired liner brush. It's Hobby Lobby's generic, and it is my absolute favorite liner brush. So if you do live near a Hobby Lobby, about every 3 weeks or so, those go on sale for 50% off, and I always just stock up then. And I'm starting to build up the texture of the fur right on top of the dark base that I have here. And I want to let some of that dark base show through. It's making it easier for me. It's kind of skipping a step because I don't have to come back through and add more details of the little dark bits in between the fur section. And I want to watch which direction the fur is going in. I want to really watch how long each brush stroke is. For the stripes, I'm just painting them a blue color just so that I can go darker from there. I can add my darker shadows or lighter from there. It just gives me a nice kind of mid-range to build up the black areas of the stripes on the tiger. Or given me and my inability to use the proper name for things, I should probably just call this guy a zebra. So I'm using that charcoal pencil. You saw me redraw in some of the stripes because I had originally missed some. They weren't quite where I wanted them to be, so I went back through and corrected some of that. Now this here, I started glazing a little bit of that reddish brown color. It was super, super way too red. And you can see from the photo of the finished painting, not what I'm going to go with. I can go back and change that later on, so it's no big deal. Remember, as you're painting, there's no point that you're going to hit something that you just can't go back and fix. If you have a bad layer, it doesn't mean you've ruined anything. It just means you're not finished yet. Keep layering, keep building until it looks how you want. And all of those layers that you look at and you think, I don't like this layer, or it looked better the previous layer and now I've messed stuff up, all of that shows through just a bit. And especially with the Liquitex Basics, they're somewhat translucent, or the majority of them are. And so when you put more layers on top, those previous bad layers, they're very subtle. They'll just peek through a little bit, and it adds so much depth. So bad layers actually are doing you a favor. Coming through here, and this is where I'm using the same techniques that you saw much slower on the bouquet bird from last week, where I add the paint while it's wet, it's on top of a dry area, and I smudge the wet paint into the dry area along those edges. And that's what I'm doing here to get that very soft look. And so it has a very similar look to the airbrush. Remember, with the reflections, it's not just a mirrored image of whatever the main subject is. I wouldn't just draw, and I've seen people do this before. I remember in high school watching other students really excited because they figured they could just redraw or draw out, trace out the subject, flip it upside down, and there's your reflection. It's not. That's not going to be accurate. Your reflection is always going to be at a different angle. It's viewing the main subject at a different angle than the subject, so it wouldn't look right just to mirror that exactly. And this one, the water is going to be broken up so much, you're really not seeing, you're just seeing the color, hints of the color. You're not seeing details of the tiger in the reflection. So this is actually a much easier reflection to accomplish, I think, than one that's very, very detailed. So I'm starting to come through here with the darks, and that dark, it's a mixture of brown, black, and a deep violet color. It's not just straight black. I normally will avoid, I use black a lot in my work, so don't mistake me there. I love using black paint, but I will normally mix it with other colors so that it doesn't come out too flat. Pulling some of the orange of the tiger in there, and I can come back through later on. I don't need any of these colors to be perfect. Using a bit of transparent mixing white mixed with some of that deep violet in here. Letting that blend out. I really like the transparent mixing white because it makes the white more translucent. It's not quite so foggy. I'm going to save my straight titanium white for the highlights in the water, the really shiny, shiny spots. In the transparent mixing white, I'm using the Liquitex Heavy Body. Everything else in this painting is the Liquitex Basics, and then I switched to the Heavy Body for the transparent mixing white, although I did recently buy some Liquitex Soft Body transparent mixing white. I have a feeling I'm going to like that a little bit better, just because it's not going to be as thick. And since I typically thin my paint out so much, that one will probably be a better fit for me. So I'm coming back through. Again, this is that black mixed with some of the violet and brown. And I'm breaking up the water. Now, this reference photo comes from wildlifereferencephotos.com. If you want to paint this exact tiger, you can pick this up from them there. You would need to buy the photo in order to paint the same one so that you've got the license at that point to use this reference photo. But the water, if you go and look at that photo, I am not copying it exactly. It's close. And the same thing is I add these little green bits, the floaty leaf guys. I don't know what the technical term is there. I'm sure one of you guys will. It's not, I don't have to make it exact. And I don't even have as many of those little green bits as what the reference photo had. But I still am able to, much easier without putting that much work into it, capture that same feel. And it's the same with the water ripples. They don't need to be exact. I just want them to be close. You can see I've added some of those and just smudged it out with a clean dry brush. That's the exact same thing I did on that bouquet bird. I'm just going to layer and layer and layer until it looks how I want. The majority of the early layers don't look good. I do not like how they look at all when I'm first doing these first layers like this. Don't let that discourage you. Just keep layering until it does look good. One of the biggest problems that a lot of artists have when they're not happy with their work is that they're calling it finished too soon. I used to do that myself. I would spend 45 minutes on a pet portrait and it didn't look realistic enough. And when I stopped and thought, okay, I'm going to put 8 hours into this instead, the difference was night and day. Just slow down, put a bit more time, keep layering, keep building. Just because there's paint on the canvas and color in approximately the right place, that probably doesn't mean you're finished. Notice as I start building these ripples, the majority of the ripples, and this is really important, are more horizontal. I'll do a long horizontal line, short diagonal, long horizontal. So I make this zigzag, but that diagonal I want for the most part to be short. The majority of my long lines really need to be long and horizontal. Otherwise, I end up having water that looks like it's kind of drooping to one side. It gives it a surreal feel that is not the surreal feel I'm going for. I've mixed a lighter color now and putting this on top of my darker oranges for these ripples. And see how as you build this, as you layer this, and I know this moves fast, so you're not really seeing the brush strokes, but what you really want to look at here, look at the way I'm layering the color, the way that I'm building this. I think that that's really the most beneficial thing for these videos is just seeing the layering process and the way that I'm building it. It's not a matter of just put the right color in the right place. That's not going to look super realistic. I'm building this. So more of those little green bits, my technical term there. So now I'm going to go back up to the tiger to work on him more. Normally, I work just on one area at a time. I wouldn't have started the tiger until the background was finished, but because I worked on this for the live stream, I just wanted to focus on some of the tiger fur for that first live stream. This one, we are back to the live stream. So this is going really fast. Again, you can watch this in real time over on that, and I'll have a card pop up so you can check that out. But here, I'm using a rake brush to start building up. This is a low Cornell rake brush. That one's one of my favorites. And I'm starting to build up between that one and actually this one here is just a flat brush that's damaged, so it works a lot like a rake brush. And if you don't know what a rake brush is, if you put your hand in front of you with your fingers, your hand just flat and your fingers close together, that's your normal brush, maybe a filbert. Now spread your fingers apart, there's your rake brush. So one brush stroke, you're getting a lot of different little mini brush strokes. Now when I use a rake brush, I don't do it for everything. I will almost always go back through with a liner or another smaller brush around or something so that I can break that up and start forming into clumps and clusters. Because if you overdo a rake brush, whether you're painting that grass with it or fur, it's really easy to have something that looks too uniform. So that's why I will always use another brush to go back and break those up. And I'm just slowly building up my fur here, one bit at a time. So now I'm adding the black back in, reforming some of the stripes that I don't like how I've got them shaped. Your stripes don't have to be exact to your reference photo. It is totally okay if you decide to change some of them because you think it'll look better. There are times on tigers especially where it feels like I've got an empty spot where it's just too orange and I think it'll look better if I throw an extra stripe in there. That's totally okay. That is where, as an artist, you get to, I mean, the goal for me, if I'm using a reference photo, I want to take that reference photo and make it my own, make it unique. And in this case, I blurred out the background. I changed, if you go look at this reference photo over on wildlifereferencephotos.com, you'll see the background was much more detailed. It wasn't, your focus wasn't as much here, but on the tiger, none of that is coming out right. Falling all over my words here, but I wanted my focus more on the tiger and more on the fireflies in the water. And so I just softened out, darkened up that background, pushed it back. So now I'm starting to build up now this fur would be more white, but look how, because it's in shadow, I'm not just going to jump to straight white. And that's another thing that you want to watch when you're painting wildlife. Don't paint white fur white. Just keep that for your brightest highlights. The majority of it is going to be much, much darker, and just the highlights will have the white in there. If I pull too many highlights early on, if I use too much white paint, like even if let's say you're painting a white tiger or a snow leopard, you don't want to just jump straight into white. You can't go brighter from there. Go dark and then come back. As you can see, I can come back now and start adding in these highlights. Now for this guy, because so much of this is cast in shadow and just his markings in general, or the shade of his fur here, there's no white on his neck. That's unbleached titanium white for my highlights mixed in with some of the browns. But don't be so quick to look at something and go, okay, it's white, I'm going to paint it white. No, white is rarely white. It's very reflective. It's going to pick up all of the colors around it or the shadows around it. You're not going to just want to paint things flat white, or it does come out very flat. You won't have the dimension then. So look how many browns. I've got some purples. unbleached titanium white. There is some raw sienna mixed in with that. And I want to build the clumps and clusters of fur. I'm not going to sit there with a liner brush and try to paint in each individual strand because that's really normally not going to look that realistic. He'll end up looking like he has wiry or plastic hair. So instead, I'm using a bigger brush stroke and just focusing on the individual clumps and clusters, not individual strands. I will put in a few individual strands, but I don't want all of them to show, or he just doesn't have that soft feel that I'm going for here. And you can see the color isn't even close to what I'm going to want it to be. Right now, he's very dull, very muted, and I want that to have that brighter orange. And I'm also going to pull in a lot of magenta. Anytime for me, and this isn't like a rule for anybody, it's just how I like to paint. If I have an animal that's going to have orange or tan in the fur, I will almost always use a violet or a magenta color for a lot of the shadows. I love those colors together, and that's just personal preference for me. But you'll see me pull a lot of magentas into this as well that were not in the reference photo. So starting on the details of the nose. And notice the fur on the chin. There's another area. It's very dark. I don't want to just jump straight to white or it looks too flat. I'll put some white highlights later on, but I don't want to jump there. Another thing I want to point out, the fur on the bridge of the nose is extremely short. I don't want to add too much detail there. I want to keep it, I'm almost dry brushing at some points, which is not a technique I use often, but for creating that really, really short fur, that's going to look better than if you try to paint in a bunch of little brush strokes. It'll make the fur in that area look too long. So the trick is to create the texture without looking too fluffy. So there you can see not a lot of detail on the bridge of the nose. And if you want the fur to look like it's short and pointing at the viewer, because the fur is going to change. Some will be laying sideways, some will point at you, and that's another trick on making it look more three-dimensional. Don't try to just make all the fur look flat and sideways. That may look good for one area, but if you try to repeat that same brush stroke over the entire animal, you end up with something that looks very, very flat, very cartoony. So instead, you're going to have some of those brush strokes or some of those bits of hair will be pointing or aiming basically at the viewer, and in that case, that's just dots. Dots are a really handy thing when you're painting fur. For the shorter fur or for fur that is facing the viewer, dots are great. And I usually will do that just with my liner brush. So now that is the rake brush. That's the low Cornell one that I liked. And I'm starting to build up the texture in the fur there. Just little brush strokes. So it's still soft. I don't want too much detail. And that one is a filbert brush, rake brush. I don't like the flat ones because it comes out, it's way too uniform. It's too harsh where the start and stop points are. The filbert rake brushes I like much, much better. I'm able to get a much more natural look. And with that brush, half the time, I'm just using it as a regular liner or a regular filbert brush. I'm not trying to use it as a liner brush, or gosh, words are so hard right now. I'm not trying to use it as a rake brush all of the time. If I'm using it as a rake brush, I'm going to thin the paint a little bit and I'm not going to push as hard with the brush. If I'm using it as a filbert, I can load more paint on it and push a little bit heavier, which is what I'm doing right here. You can see how I'm pushing heavier. You don't see the individual brush strokes there because I'm pushing too hard. So I'm using it, basically one brush gives me several different looks. So there was my first layer. Let that dry, and now I'm going to tint that color a bit. Got some of my burnt sienna I'm mixing in there with my raw sienna and some unbleached titanium white. And I like the unbleached titanium white better because it's warmer than titanium white in a lot of this. You can use titanium white if that's what you have, but you're going to have to glaze over it more to tone that color down so it's not so, the titanium white's too cool of a color for what I'm going for here. So now I'm using this as a rake brush. You can see those individual brush strokes in there. That's that same low Cornell rake. Another rake brush that I've liked fairly well is the one by Bob Ross, and it's one of the only Bob Ross products that work well for the way that I paint. His painting style is very different than mine, so most of his products aren't a fit for me. But I do like, he's got a wildlife fur brush that's pretty nice. See, I'm just building just that hint of fur. The fur in here is going to be wet. It's going to be fairly sleek, so I don't want it to look too fluffy. Starting to add in the black stripes. And see how the edges are jagged. I don't want these to be perfectly smooth or he'll look like a cartoon. I need it to look like there's that fur in there. I was going to say fluffy fur, but I really don't want it to be fluffy at this point either. Now here, this fur is wet. That fur is going to clump a bit more because that's really wet and it's clumping. So see how I broke it up? I used black to create the shadow, or actually it was black mixed with some deep violet. And then I went back through with my unbleached titanium white for a few highlights, and it really gave it that shiny look in those areas. So now I'm going to start glazing. I've got all my detail in there. Watch what a difference tinting the color makes. And so these colors are fairly translucent. I'm using some deep violet. I'm also using magenta. I'm using some orange mixed with those colors. And now normally I would not say jump straight to orange on a tiger. That's not going to be very natural, but in this case it's an extremely translucent orange. The Liquitex Basics oranges are really, really translucent, not very much pigment in those. So they're perfect if you're glazing. That's what I like them for. But it's letting the color that's underneath show through, so it's not looking like it's just straight rainbow orange. I don't want rainbow orange on the tiger. You will not look realistic, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute. So breaking up the clumps of the wet fur there. Now as I get to this stage of the painting, when I'm towards the end, I stop looking so much at the reference photo and start focusing on what can I change about my painting to make it look a little bit more realistic, or make it look better. Not even necessarily realistic. Sometimes I don't want it more realistic. Sometimes I just think it'll look better if I change something. So there are my whiskers using that liner brush. Some little highlights under the eye there. Again, this is where I just start looking at mine. What can I change? What will look better? And I have to take a lot of steps away from my canvas to make that decision. When you're up close to it, and especially one like this is a 24 by 36 inch canvas. It's big. On something like this, when you're sitting this close, you just lose sight of it. You can't see certain things. Back away across the room, or if your room that you're painting in isn't big enough to really back far away, take a photo with your cell phone. When you shrink it down into a small scale, you can notice things that might pop out. Maybe something's too dark, something's too light. You'll notice things that you wouldn't have noticed before, things that you can then go back and make a change on. I also like to do that with my cell phone and adjust my contrast, because sometimes you'll make some, like, hype up the contrast and realize it looks way better. Then go back to your artwork and make those changes. So here, even this is not straight titanium white. This, I'm using white mixed with a bit of blue, so I've got kind of a grayish tone for a lot of these bright, the sparkly areas on the water. I don't use very much straight titanium white in this painting at all. And not just this painting, in general. Too much white doesn't look very realistic. In most cases. I know somebody's going to point out an exception to that rule. There's always exceptions to everything. The fireflies, I'm just airbrushing those in, and I do have a video showing you how to do those both with the airbrush and without. Both methods are extremely easy. The airbrush is just a little bit easier. So I airbrushed them first white, then I went on top of it with a warmer yellow color, and then I'll go back through on the very centers with a sharper white dot in the middle. Few more highlights there in the water. And that is it for this painting. This ended up being one of my absolute favorite paintings. And as I was looking at it, I was thinking, it's just so encouraging to see this and where I started when I would paint wildlife. Here's a painting. This one, it would be from, I want to say it was around 1998 or 1999. So it's a really old one. I mean, look at the difference in the tiger back then versus this tiger. And the important thing to notice here is I wanted that tiger to look like this one, but I didn't know how to do it. It's just so encouraging to see. You can go from having your artwork look more cartoony, and I know that's a common complaint for artists. They want it to look more realistic, but it looks cartoony at the moment. You can start there, and if you keep painting and painting and painting, you will end up creating work exactly how you want to. If you would have showed me the painting that I just finished back 20 years ago, I never would have believed you that that was something I created. I was stuck in this mindset of the cartoony looking one, and I mean the cartoony one's fun, but it's not what I wanted. It wasn't what I was trying to paint, and I got stuck in the mindset of, well, that's just my style. That's just how I paint, and that's not how painting painting works. If you want to improve on something, if you want to get to the point where you're painting things super realistic, that comes from time and from practice. There was no magical trick I can tell you other than paint all the time, nonstop paint. And every painting you make is going to get you closer to that end goal of making things more realistic. My other tip, though, I do have one big tip for you. Do not limit yourself to painting or for tutorials or lessons or books for beginners. Start there, fine. Do 2, 3, 4 paintings for beginners, or if that's just something that you think is fun, fine. But if you are trying to get to the goal that I was of making things more realistic, you've got to start painting things that are more advanced. Even if what you paint doesn't look very good, it doesn't look very advanced, you may feel when you paint something beginner, I'm a beginner, so I'm going to feel more accomplished, like it looks just like the teachers did. Yes, but it's beginner. You're not going to progress past that if you stay for things for beginners. But things for beginners are great to get you started. Don't stay there. Once you've done 3 or 4 or 5 paintings, jump to as advanced as you can find, because you're going to learn, you're going to improve so much faster than if you had otherwise stuck with those things for beginners. But don't ever be discouraged either, thinking I'm never going to paint something that realistic, because like I said, if you would have showed me this 20 years ago, I never would have believed I could have reached this point. I'm so happy. I mean, this is what I wanted to do and I wasn't able to back then. Just remember, anytime anything is not coming out how you wanted to, you're just one step closer to that goal. You will get there as long as you stick to it. There's a little house finch sitting out on my balcony, peeping away and watching me. I think I'm being stalked by a house finch. Can you hear him? He's adorable. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going towards it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my art videos every week. I have to stop saying that because it's just not true anymore. YouTube is not notifying people anymore. So you may want to also sign up for my email newsletter. I send that out once a week. That goes out every Wednesday, letting you know whatever videos I had go up the previous week. And it also will let you know when that week's live stream is, which is always Wednesdays at 8 p.m.